Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I've got a really interesting gentleman to introduce you to tonight. Rick Anderson, who is a principal of Earnscliffe Strategy Group. He's the chair of nationalnewswatch.com. He's a director of the Canadian Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Association. And he's just a guy involved in tons of different political stuff. I met him, I think 3 decades ago when he was a liberal. Then he became a reform, then he became a conservative, and now he's on national TV all the time. He's probably one of the most plugged in political guys I know. Rick, welcome to our show. How are you?
Great to hear from you. Great to talk to you, Brian. Looking forward to the conversation.
So tell me, you've been posting a lot on vaccines and tracking our performance versus every other country. I guess that's the number one topic that everyone's interested in right now. How do you think we're doing?
Well, we're doing fine now. We had a bald patch there from specifically January 22nd to February 14th, where our just growing and young supply chain dried up on us. Moderna basically didn't deliver anything during that period of time, and Pfizer delivered about less than half of what we had been expecting. So we had a real dry patch, lasted 3 weeks. We fell 3 weeks behind the EU, which is who I compare us to most closely. But since then, since February the 14th, we're basically on the same trajectory. It's growing fast. Every week we receive more vaccine than the week before, and we administer more. So we're catching up.
Now, I think you and some other people have made the point that some of the countries that are way ahead of us are using either Chinese or Russian vaccines that may or may not be, efficacious. They're certainly not approved in Canada. What do you think of that?
Well, I mean, I don't want to disparage those vaccines. Millions of people around the world are receiving them. Western regulators in the EU, UK, United States, Canada have not evaluated them. We've not been provided with clinical trial data that we require in order to approve them. So most Western countries are not using them, but a whole lot of other countries are. So people keep putting out these lists saying Canada's number 45 or 48 or so on behind so and so and so and so and so and so. But they're fishing in a different pond than we are. And we're competing with, most other Western democracies for, what is a specific pool of 4 vaccines by 4 manufacturers. So only 3 of whom have actually got supply available right now. So that's a pretty tight competition. And we're doing all right in that competition. We're in the middle of the pack. As I mentioned a minute ago, we're really tracking with the EU very closely. We're not going to compete with the United States and UK, who are basically manufacturing them domestically, but everybody else is having to buy from basically them, and we're doing pretty well amongst that group, which is really what I think of as our peer group.
Now, Astrazeneca is not approved in the United States, and we've borrowed, it would appear, a sizable amount of Astrazeneca vaccines from the United States. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. It is approved here. It is approved in the EU. It is approved in, and of course, the UK. But it's gone through a longer process of approval in the United States. You remember there was some confusion and some controversy around the original clinical trial data last December, and the United States, the FDA at that point in time said we want a full-blown clinical trial conducted in the United States up to our standards. I mean, I think the UK one was also up to the UK standards, but the US wanted to do their own. So that has now been completed, I understand. The data has been supplied to the FDA, and most people think that the FDA is about to approve AstraZeneca, just as the EU, UK, and Canada have. But we'll see. It'll be in April that happens. So meanwhile, the United States has got quite a stockpile of it, which they're not using because they haven't yet approved it. And it does have a time, best before date on it. And so they've offered generously to lend us 1.5 million doses, which we can well use right now. And we'll repay that out of supply we receive later on.
Now,
presumably because they will have approved it by then.
I know you're not a physician, but you've been following this pretty closely. There were some issues in regards to blood clots, and a bunch of European countries stopped using the AstraZeneca vaccine for a while. I'm set to take it on Tuesday. What do you think? Should I take it?
I think you should follow the advice that you're given here in Canada, which is to take the first of the authorized vaccines that you're presented with. And in that case, it would be AstraZeneca. That was a very small number of blood clots people were talking about, and they're not uncommon to begin with. I'm not a medical doctor. I'm not a scientist. I rely, like you, Brian, on the advice of the authorities on this, and they're saying that that drug is safe for people to use.
So what do you think? We've got, I think it's 2 or 3 Canadian domestic vaccine manufacturers, but all of their studies are such that we're not going to get approval for at the earliest into the summertime. Have we done something wrong?
Well, I don't think we've done something wrong in the pandemic period. I don't think you can go from a standing start to a finished product in the time frame that we've been talking about, unless you're already in the business and already have a product that's well advanced and and the infrastructure to test it, to trial it, and to manufacture it quickly. So, to the people who say, well, if we'd done this or that last March or April or May, we would have a Canadian made in Canada vaccine right now. I don't believe that's true. But should we have been doing something different for the last 10 or 15 or 20 years? Yes, I think we should have.
Which is supporting a domestic vaccine manufacturing.
Yes. Well, not specifically vaccine, but pharmaceuticals, whether it's, distributed by a vaccine or a pill, doesn't really make much difference to people. It's the pharmaceutical industry that we're talking about. And particularly the biosciences side of it these days. I mean, two of the first 2 drugs that were approved for COVID-19 were both the new kind of biosciences, mRNA vaccines. Not very many countries and companies in the world that are as advanced as the ones who produced those quickly. And it was because they've been working, they were close to having them. One of them was developed for SARS a few years ago and not used because SARS went away before it was finished, which tells you something about the timelines for these vaccines. I mean, the ones that have come through the process in the last 12 months, you're probably familiar with the pharmaceutical industry to some extent, Brian. I'm sure you are. I know you are. To take a drug from a standing start and get it trialed and out in the market and approved and out in the marketplace in 12 months has never happened before. So to have 3 of them and now 4 with J&J, that's really quite remarkable. I don't think the companies that we're talking about, I think we should support those companies, the ones you're talking about in Canada, but I don't think we should support them because they would have delivered or will deliver a vaccine in the time frame that's relevant for this particular pandemic.
But we should support them so that we've got them to develop things in the future.
I think so. But here's my caveat. Basically, we've slipped into a bit of a mentality in Canada of being buyers of drugs, of pharmaceutical products, rather than makers. And there's a quite different mindset of that. If you're buyers of drugs, you're looking for the best price. You're looking for the best deal. We buy them in huge quantities in our 10 provinces for our healthcare system. So we've got tremendous buying power, and we use it to drive the prices down. We also, substitute generics quite quickly, as quickly as we can. And the insurance companies that are operating in Canada on the healthcare side also do the same thing. So we have kind of an environment here which is basically geared towards buying at the lowest possible price, which is defensible from a public policy point of view. But it's the opposite mentality if you see yourself as a maker of pharmaceuticals, where you're basically trying to support the homegrown industry. You don't mind seeing them being profitable. In fact, you want them to be profitable. And you're balancing out the buying on the one hand with the cultivating the industry on the other side. And right now, the pandemic is kind of making us rethink this. But, it's been a long time since we thought of ourselves in public policy terms as something other than buyers trying to get the best possible price. I mean, the current federal government promised to chop $1 billion out of pharmaceutical prices in Canada. So that's the kind of thing. Well, the industry goes, okay, so fine, we'll be competitive in your pricing and so on. But if you also want to be hosting R&D and manufacturing and so on, you should be clear what your public policy priorities are. Is it to nurture the industry, or is it to get the best possible deal and have them made wherever they can be made?
So pharmaceutical pricing in the United States is typically, other than in generics, but significantly higher. And in fact, some pharmaceutical companies, particularly biotech companies, get products approved and launched in the United States and don't even bring them to Canada because they don't want to give the reference pricing that would necessitate a far lower benchmark price in the United States and elsewhere around the world. So we really have followed this strategy in Canada of just going for the cheapest price and letting the rest of the world be the innovator. You're suggesting we need to change that.
I'm saying we should have that discussion. Like a lot of people are saying, well, we should change it. I'm saying, well, understand this is not just a question of supporting one or two companies. This is a question of that whole mentality in 10 provinces of every, week after week, year after year, buying pharmaceutical products as governments trying to save our taxpayers, our customers, our patients money, rather than nurturing an industry. And so we shouldn't just think of this as, basically switching over pharmaceutical healthcare is the biggest cost of most of our governments, provincial governments in Canada, as you well know. And pharmaceuticals are a big and growing part of that cost. It's not for nothing that they have decided that the best idea here is to buy at the best possible price, the lowest possible price.
And
that's really the
NDP
public
and
policy.
The Liberal Party are talking about national pharmacare. That expenditure could only go up. Yes,
I think that would be. Yeah, it's not a public policy idea. I think makes much sense. Frankly, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. We have a pretty good pharmaceutical insurance program in Canada, put through by the private sector. Most employers provide it to their employees. There's lots of insurance companies that provide it. There's about 15, maybe 20% of Canadians who aren't covered that way. And we should make sure that we're fixing that gap, addressing that gap so that nobody is not covered for the pharmaceuticals they need. But we don't need to throw out the 80% that's working in order to deal with the 20% that isn't.
We're chatting tonight with Rick Anderson about a whole bunch of different issues. I'm going to take a break for some messages and come back more with Rick. And we're going to talk about some of the big challenges facing governments in Canada. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Wire Saga 960. Chatting tonight with a gentleman that I have a lot of respect for. I met him in politics, I think 3 decades ago or so. Rick Anderson is his name. And Rick, you've been involved in a couple of different political parties and evolutions and things like that. You made a tweet. You put out a tweet the other day. Actually, I think it's today, that I found really quite fascinating. Let me read it. So, we are in the process of rethinking the geopolitical world order, social justice, policing, seniors care, clean energy, and local supply chains, while coping with a global virus we still don't understand, plus massive new debt loads. That should keep us all pretty busy. What's your point? Do you think government is up to this task? Sounds like you don't think so.
Well, I put that up, I think around New Year's. I can't remember, but I would say our governments deserve, by and large, passing marks for how the pandemic is being managed. I expect that, a lot of people might disagree with this, but we've got one of the lowest death rates in the Western world. The debt that's being piled up, of course, is massive, and we're going to need to deal with this when we get out of here, which is hopefully soon. And of course, the restrictions on our freedom of movement and everything else on our economy are pretty profound. But having said all that, I think the Canadian people have behaved extremely, as citizens, as individuals, quite responsibly throughout this whole thing. And I think our governments have done well in a really difficult environment. With a lot of conflicting advice at times coming from the scientific and medical communities. I think we've picked our way through this in a way that's kind of exemplary.
So you talk about some of the other issues. Let's talk about them a little bit. Geopolitical world order. The headlines in the newspaper today was that Russia, China, U.S. are potentially in a new Cold War. What do you think is going to happen in our geopolitical world order?
Well, that's a pretty unsettled and frankly threatening environment. There's no question about it. China is behaving quite aggressively in its region, and the definition of its geographic sphere of influence is expanding all the time. Up into the Arctic, into Africa, right into our own countries, and so on. And frankly, they're not playing by the rules. They're now a maturing economy. They're not the kind of economy we operate. But we've given them access to our markets, and they haven't reciprocated by giving us the same sort of protection, legal protections and everything else, and trade protections as we've extended to them. So we're going to have to square that circle on the economic front, and we're going to have to square it somehow in terms of some of the threatening tactics that China is using in different parts of the world, right, including especially right in its own backyard. So that's a very difficult environment for everybody in the world, and I think most leaders around the world are conscious of it, of the things that could go wrong there.
What more should the Canadian government be doing?
Well, I think there's safety in numbers. We're, a small country, and as China is demonstrating with the two Michaels, the imprisonment of the two Michaels, they're prepared to bully us, and there's not, frankly, a whole lot we as an individual country can do about that. I think it's welcome that the President of the United States is forthrightly taken up our position on this. I mean, frankly, as we all know, the two hostages, basically, that's what they are, the Chinese are holding, are a result of us, following our rule of law, which is responding to an American extradition treaty. So the Americans helped get us into this situation. And of course, President Trump was doing nothing to help us in that situation. In fact, made it worse by sort of engaging in some public argy-bargy with the Chinese. If you do this for me, maybe those guys will come free. We'll let her free, and made her seem like a hostage, which wasn't how we were treating her. Isn't how we were treating them. So President Biden has made that better, but the situation continues. They went to trial on Monday with no notice. Didn't provide access to Canadian diplomats. We haven't seen the evidence. We're not able to provide them with legal or consular support. There's a couple of people there being tried in a foreign country in an opaque, secret process that's got a very hurry-up quality to it. We have no idea what kind of evidence they think they've got against them with respect to the alleged wrongdoing. And we basically don't believe they're guilty of anything. So it's a very troubling circumstance. And I think the thing that's going on is that we're reaching out to our allies around the world, and we've got a couple of dozen of them that have agreed that China needs to start conducting itself differently on matters like this. I think that's the right way to be doing this at this point in time.
Your second issue is social justice. A lot of people think racial injustice because of what happened, last spring in Minneapolis and all the riots around the protests and then riots around the United States and frankly, the rest of the world is a big issue. But you didn't use racial injustice. You talked about social justice. What do you think the issue is there?
Well, part of it's racial or ethnic or cultural. In Canada, of course, Indigenous reconciliation is a real thing that we're trying to. I think if I could change one single thing about Canada, is that we've moved to a better relationship with our Indigenous peoples. I'm not saying there's only one thing that needs to be addressed in the country, but I would put that pretty much at the top of my list in terms of a chronic problem that it's time to solve. So that's a form of social justice. I think that we've seen again in the pandemic, the fragility of women's role in the workplace has been under pressure again. They've suffered more than men have, in terms of economic impacts from the pandemic. And I think there's going to be a robust recovery that is actually already started and is going to accelerate during the course of this year. But we need to make sure that women in particular participate as fully in that as they participated in dislocation last year, meaning that they get back to at least where they were. And we need to get serious about, full-blown equality in the workplace. And I think part of that is coming to terms with the childcare discussion that we've been having for years in this country, and to really make it a serious, part of the social support system in our country. I don't particularly think that necessarily means it all has to be run by the government. I like informal forms of, family-based or neighborhood-based healthcare. I think people should have choices, but they should have choices. They should have access to it, and they should have access to it affordably. So I think that probably means some measure of public subsidy, significant measure of public subsidy. That's another form of social justice. So I think there's a lot of pieces to that puzzle. We don't have quite the income disparity the United States have, but that doesn't mean there are not people being left behind in Canada. I think there is that too. I think one of the things liked watching during the pandemic, and not too many things I've enjoyed watching during the pandemic, but this is one of them. We're having a more open-minded discussion about certain things. And one of them was it was income supports, has been income supports. I like the idea of a basic income. I'm not sure it's a practical possibility, but it's an interesting goal. And whether we do it as a program or as a goal, I think we need to figure out how to provide people with a basic living wage, one way or another. I tend to identify more with conservatives these days than anything else. Although in partisan terms, I actually consider myself an independent these days. But I come at things on the economic side more from a conservative or pro-market side of things. And I think conservatives need to stop getting a rash every time someone talks about raising minimum wages. They're not high in this country, and it's not true that when you raise them slightly, $1 or $2, some people just go into panic mode when you say that, particularly in service industries where there are a lot of part-time workers and younger workers and so on. But I think we need to stop reacting to it so negatively and so reflexively, and understand this is an important part of the not just economic puzzle, but social puzzle for the country.
Some people have been arguing for a guaranteed annual income for a long time, and we really have, as you point out, sort of experimented with that this past year. Do you think it's a good idea?
Well, like I said, it's a good concept. It's an interesting concept, and from a social justice point of view, and I also mean from an economic point of view, because if people at the lower end of the income scale are getting better incomes, they're probably spending them on the economy as well. So I don't think it's just a social issue; it's also an economic issue. These are also consumers. So I do think that it's actually something we should think harder about and move closer to. But whether we deliver it through social programs or minimum wage or a combination of those, but we should be seeking to raise the opportunities to improve the opportunities for income earning for people at the lower end of the spectrum. I think that's important for them as individuals. I think it's important for our society. I think it's beneficial for our economy.
Your third
I
issue.
think we should experiment further with a guaranteed annual income. As you say, we've kind of been doing that during the pandemic. In certain areas, like farmers have been saying, we're having trouble with people say, well, you won't pay me more than I'm making through the wage benefit program. So they're showing that the downside, the criticism of guaranteed annual incomes, is that it makes people reluctant to work. I don't really think that of people at a large scale, but that doesn't mean it doesn't happen sometimes. And so how do you avoid those unintended consequences would be one of the questions. And it does seem, people do say anecdotally it's been happening in certain sectors of Canada during the pandemic. Maybe that's just a sign that they're paying them too little. But
your third issue was policing. Do you support defunding the police? It was interesting. Sunday New York Times had a long story about really analysis of what went wrong during the protests and riots last spring in the United States. And it was shocking at how many police forces across the United States weren't prepared. They had, handcuffs, plastic handcuffs that were so old and brittle that they didn't work, that they blinded something like 5 or 6 people because they hadn't training in how to use pepper spray. It went on and on about how unprepared the police were to deal with the protests. And then we had lots of conversations in the last little while about how police forces have been really often acting as mental health workers and aren't trained for that. What do you think needs to happen with policing?
I think we need significant reform, not defunding. I mean, I think, frankly, at the end of the day, it's probably more funding that's necessary, not less. So I think the term defunding is misleading and polarizing. But I understand what its roots are. Its roots are we're giving people money to behave in an overly aggressive, overly militarized fashion when more subtle means of dealing with aggression or with conflict or demonstrations, which are peaceful or sometimes aren't, what they're really saying is not get rid of policing, it's rethink it. But they called it defunding. So if that's the question, no, I don't support defunding policing. But I do think we need to rethink how we're doing it. I think in Canada, we tend to have that going on as an ongoing process. Although we do know we don't get it right. all the time. And there's probably still a lot of work to be done. You know, when you see these incidents where a police officer becomes involved in basically a crime, an act of violence against a citizen, it doesn't necessarily seem to be called for. You know, maybe they've responded a bit too aggressively. You often find that there's a record of them having, you know, a prior record of them having been inclined that way, and you kind of scratch your head and say, well, why are they still out there?
Yeah.
You know, is there, you know, is there not at some point in time you say this person is not cut out for this kind of work, or needs to do a different part of this kind of work? You say, you know, as you're mentioning, mental health issues, domestic disputes. You know, we've got a police officer in our family, and I know, you know, I have some indirect exposure to the stress and the danger that's involved there. I think we're all kind of aware of it, but you know, when you've got someone close to you who's doing that kind of work, you really kind of have a different kind of feeling about it, and you understand how difficult these jobs are at the multiple levels that you're interacting with people, and you don't always know whether there's a mental health problem there, or a gun in the house, or in the glove compartment. You know, it's not easy to calibrate the level of the type of response that's necessary. But I think writ large, we shouldn't just import what's happening in the States and Canada into Canada and say, well, this is happening here. We don't have the same problems, I think, of racism in our police forces, at least not in extent, as America seems to have these days, nor of violence. But that doesn't mean we don't have our own problems in those areas, and that we shouldn't be thinking hard about them and approaching them more thoughtfully.
You know, I've been surprised. I've done a bunch of interviews with people of racism in institutions, whether they be police or the legal system, the legal justice system, or schools in the Greater Toronto area, particularly Peel, and people perceive a lot more racism than I ever thought existed. And so it's not something I was aware of. And I probably thought historically, like you, that the US was a different kind of a situation. And a lot of people, Black people, African Canadians, have told me that it's actually easier to see the racism in the United States because it's more overt, while in Canada it's a little bit more hidden. And so it's an issue.
It is an issue. I think we, you know, I like Canada. I like this country, and I think that one of the reasons it makes it so wonderful is that we may not see these things until they're brought to our attention, but when they are, we open our ears and our eyes and we say, okay, well, let's have a conversation about that, and let's figure out what's going wrong. Because, like you say, you know, your experience and my experience with law enforcement, yours is probably milder than mine, but you know, I had a bit of a wayward youth. You know. I didn't never encounter any of the kind of problems that people are talking about, of, you know, excessive force and so on. But that's, of course, not true for other people in our society, and we need to listen to that, and we need to understand why that's happening, and to stop it.
We're chatting tonight with Rick Anderson. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back more with Rick. We've been talking about a lot of social issues. I'm going to switch gears and ask him about some economic issues. Wait a minute, and more with Rick Anderson. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. We're chatting tonight with Rick Anderson. He's principal of Earnscliffe. He's a political junkie guy, operative, whatever. I don't know exactly what you call him, but he's been around politics for a long time. And he's a very smart, very tuned in kind of guy, knowing what's going on not only in Canada, but around the world. Rick, you were Preston Mannon's key guy at one point in time, were you not?
Yeah, campaign director for a couple of elections, 93 and 97.
And have you been that sort of senior and close to other political leaders as well?
Yes. You know, my first campaign was with Pierre Trudeau in 1974. I was a student, and I volunteered to work on a local riding campaign, walked into a campaign headquarters and volunteered. And ended up, the campaign manager came by my desk. I was stuffing envelopes or, you know, doing something strategically important like that. And he said, "You come in every day, don't you?" And I said, "Yeah, I do." And he said, "You enjoying this?" Yeah. And he said, "Well, could we hire you?" And I thought, what a wonderful profession this is. You go in as a volunteer and they offer to start paying you. So I mean, I was making, I think, $100 a week. But I worked on that campaign, and that was the campaign where Pierre Trudeau went from the minority government he'd won in the prior election to getting his majority back in that particular election. So it's got echoes of today. And I spent the next, almost 20 years, 18 years or so as an active Liberal. I worked on I ran Don Johnson's leadership campaign. I worked on Parliament Hill for a cabinet minister. I worked on Trudeau's re-election campaign in 1980, 1979. Anyway, I spent a lot of time as a Liberal, and I worked with some people. Met Paul Martin in those days, supported his campaign in 1990, his leadership campaign. But the party was drifting in directions that I did not really support. It was less democratic than I thought was important for the country, less open, more top down, and the deficits were just out of control in the country, of course, at that time. Needlessly so, by and large. So I basically, and in the 1988 election, I was actually living in the United States. And back in the 84 campaign, I worked with Don Johnson, as I mentioned, and I worked in with Turner, for the Prime Minister Turner, for the election campaign, which he lost. But at that time, the Liberal Party supported free trade, and the Conservatives were actually against it. And in between 84 and 88, they both flipped their positions. And Mulroney, of course, negotiated a free trade agreement, which the Liberals then suddenly decided they were against. And that was the first time I voted Conservative. I just thought, I did think and do think that that trade agreement was the right idea for the country. I think it's proved phenomenally beneficial for Canada. And it was really wrong for the Liberals to have opposed it. And so when Chrétien came along and became the leader and said he was going to renegotiate the whole thing and cancel the GST, I thought, I don't really agree with that, either of those positions. And I became then an independent. But then I met Preston Manning, who's a really wonderful human being and a close friend to this day. And I got involved with him. And I've been off and on with the Conservatives ever since. I'm not really, I don't love political parties. I don't think they're particularly healthy institutions. I'm drawn more towards the people and the policies than I am to the parties. But the way politics works, you're not trusted if you unless you're going to support the party, right or wrong, which I think is kind of a crazy slogan. Why would you support a party that's wrong? It doesn't make any sense to me. I'm watching the Conservatives right now to see if they actually can come up with a coherent climate policy. I think they're pretty strong. I think Aaron O'Toole's pretty strong on economic issues. But I just don't think you can kind of throw that whole climate policy discussion into a cocked hat and say, the 10% of the economy that's the energy sector, we're going to throw this sort of one of the most important policy areas that they operate under, and we're going to throw it all up for discussion again. I think you have to be clear about what you're doing and bring some predictability to that set of issues, which are important both from an environmental point of view, but also increasingly from an economic point of view.
I think you actually made a post recently about questioning political parties. Do you think political parties are not helping us anymore?
No, I don't think they're playing the role they used to play. They're not playing the role they played when I first got involved, which is almost 35 years ago. Actually, getting on towards 40, I guess. I don't like to keep track of it. They used to have a more dispersed role in terms of candidate recruitment, personnel recruitment generally, in terms of policy development. I was national coordinator for the Liberal Party in the late 70s, early 80s, and we had a big whopping delegation that we put together for one of the conventions there, and we picked 20 priority resolutions, and we got every single one of them through. One of them was to decriminalize marijuana. That was 1980. It only took 35 more years for people to get around to doing that. So in those days, political parties actually did bring up ideas like that. Guaranteed income was also one of the things that was discussed. Free trade was discussed in that kind of way. And there was much more of a fertile kind of policy discussion going on. I mentioned the personnel recruitment part. Local riding associations had a lot more autonomy to pick their local candidates than they do today, where they have to be greenlit by the center, and the leader has to agree to sign their nomination papers and veto anybody, and et cetera, et cetera. I think we've let things get very concentrated up at the leader level, given the leaders a lot of basically autocratic power. To dictate what the policy is going to be, or who the candidate's going to be, or who gets to sit in the caucus, and so on. I don't think in the whole, I understand why the operatives around the leaders like that. It's very efficient. You get to control the messaging and all that kind of stuff. But I don't think it's healthy for democracy.
It's interesting comparing Canada versus the United States, which we've had really an opportunity to do better in this past little while than ever before, given the Trump-Biden, issues, et cetera, where there really is a counterbalance, it would appear, between the power around the leader, the president, versus the power that people in the Senate and the House of Representatives have. And it appears that those, particularly senators, have independent power. Do you think that we've gone way too far with sort of the parliamentary democracy where the leader controls everything?
I do, for sure I do. I think we could stand a whole lot more independence from our members of parliament and from parliamentary committees. I mean, I think you've seen people like Wayne Easter and Anthony Housefeather, Liberal MPs, chairing committees recently that did a good job on hearings, working with the opposition parties and giving people lots of time to actually discuss things. And I think those are encouraging signs, although that's happening in kind of a minority parliament settlement where, it's a situation where the opposition parties have more members on those committees. Usually in a majority government, you don't have quite so much. And I think that's too bad, because there are a lot of good people in parliament. There are only 30 people in cabinet, and there's 300 other people in the House of Commons. And there's good people in all the parties, good ideas in all the parties. And a much better willingness to work together if the party structures would allow it to happen, and a much better ability for ideas to be generated and to get good hearings at the MP level. I don't want to be too naive about this. The MPs don't have much resources for research. Of course, the government has almost unlimited resources, so there's an imbalance there. But the answer to that is as I think, to let the MPs have more authority and so on. We've gone, and the MPs have themselves to blame for this. They've allowed this to happen over the years. Every time there's an issue that comes up, everybody turns to the leader and says, you're going to kick that person out of the caucus, you're going to discipline them, and so on. Why didn't the caucus chair do that? Why is this not something that happens more at the MP level? And I think, you mentioned this, the question you asked was about the United States. And of course, there's a cultural distinction between our two countries that we often fail to understand. And it's reflected in our constitutions, right in the basic law of the countries. I mean, the Americans, cherish life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We cherish peace, order, and good government. Those are two different things. You can say that they're kind of, we all cherish both of those things, in fact, but what do we most cherish? And, Canadians like orderliness and efficiency. Americans like chaos and confusion and competition and, and so on. And we go a little like that, and they look at us and go, oh, you're a little boring. So we are different. And of course, we're not monolithic, either one of us, so I shouldn't generalize like this, but there is a cultural difference here. So I look over to Britain and I say, well, what about Britain? We're culturally like them, probably more so the United States. We didn't rebel against them. We got given our independence. We sort of wrestled away from them, maybe. But we use the same political system. And if you go there and spend time there, which I've done, you'll find the MPs have a great deal more independence. And part of it is because they have a much bigger say in choosing the leader, and the leader doesn't sort of exist independently of, have the authority of having been elected by hundreds of thousands of people in a kind of opaque process by a lot of people who just joined up very temporarily. But in the British system, the leaders have more direct accountability to the caucus and are frequently fired by their caucuses. So I don't know. I think there's some changes we should be thinking about in terms of the power structure. Yes, I do, because I think that we're not we're not using the full talents of our members of parliament. And by failing to do that, we're not letting Parliament with 338 MPs reflect the vast diversity of ideas and cultures and regions and industries and backgrounds and so on that are present in this country. By forcing everything to go through 30 ministers and one all powerful prime minister's office, we end up filtering out a lot of stuff that we should be including.
Well, I agree with you. I think what we've created is a prime minister that actually ends up being more powerful than the president of the United States, because he controls the party. And in the United States, you really do have a counterbalancing kind of system with the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary, which we don't really have that separate legislative branch in Canada. I also like the primary system in the United States far better than the nomination system that we have in Canada, and or the leadership conventions that we have in Canada. So maybe we should have a whole show sometime on how to restructure electoral politics.
Good
We're
idea.
going to take a break and come back with some concluding comments, which I really want to ask Rick about his last comment, which is our massive new debt and what the solution is there. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've had a really interesting conversation with an old friend of mine, Rick Anderson, who is principal with Earnscliffe, a big, what is it, a public relations, government affairs company? Is that the right way to describe you?
We do communications and government affairs, lobbying sometimes, the whole gamut of communication stuff, also public opinion research.
And I really want to ask you more about political reform. And I noticed that you're head of some hydrogen organization. I really want to ask you about clean energy and hydrogen and stuff like that, but we just don't have time. So we'll have to do this again sometime, Rick. But the last point that you made in your New Year's tweet was massive new amounts of government debt. And we do. The UK, I think a week or two ago, instituted the largest single increase in corporate taxation in history. What do you think we need to do? What are we going to have to do to deal with this increased debt, if anything?
Well, we're going to have to grow our way out of it, I think is the short answer. And that's not a short process. It's a decade of repairing what we've done. In around central bank kind of worlds, they talk, and finance policy worlds, they talk about fiscal anchors. What are we attaching ourselves to? And traditionally, of course, it's the level of debt compared to the size of your economy. And it's gotten to be big. So we need to get that back under control. And there's two ways to do that. One is to start getting the spending back down. And we need to not be shy about doing a fair bit of that pretty quickly, not to hack away at things indiscriminately, but there's been a lot of ramped up spending in the last 12 months. And we don't need to sustain that. I think the government is maybe reaching too far to spend stimulus money in the budget that's upcoming, because the economy is ready to take off on its own. You can already see the signs there, and the forecasts are that we're going to grow by 5 or 6% this year. So really, what they should be doing is trying to steer that growth in particular directions, not make it happen, because I think it's going to happen on its own. So basically, they can bring the spending down. And the other side of it is the economy grows. So when, if you do that consistently for, 10 years, you're going to get the debt to GDP ratio back under control. But the wild card that's out there is that this debt is sort of sustainable at these super low interest rates we've got now. But these super low interest rates cannot stay forever. We've had them for a decade now, since the last financial crisis. And they're not going to be there. And we cannot have homeowners, businesses, and governments all leveraged to the hilt because money is cheap, 2%, 3%, and then watch it go to 5 or 6, which is a bit more normal. And then suddenly nobody can afford their mortgage, businesses can't afford to service their debt, and governments end up with great big holes in their pockets. So we need to be conscious of that. We need to be fiscally prudent. We shouldn't hack away with an axe at this, but we should take advantage of the growth we're going to have, by and large, more years than not over the next decade, to repair the balance between our debt level and the size of our economy.
I was at a wedding. I don't know, a couple of years ago, and Brian Mulroney was sitting in the corner, and I ended up sitting down and chatting with him, and we talked politics. And he said the biggest mistake Prime Minister Stephen Harper made was reducing the GST by 2 points. And he says, in the future, we're going to have a big problem, and we're going to wish to God that we had that extra 2 points. What do you think? Should we increase the GST or HST?
I think we should, yes. I don't know that I would do it right now while the economy is still in the stage that, but I would probably add a point. If we do see 5 or 6% growth this year, I would probably add a point next year on the GST. And if economic growth is sustaining, I'd do it again the following year or two. So I get back. He was right about that. I know where Harper was coming from, but I think that other taxes are better to cut than the sales tax. There's a lot of reasons for that in terms of economic strength and economic activity. But you should cut payroll taxes and income taxes before you cut sales taxes. He was also cutting those too, though, by the way. So but I think that Mulroney's right. That's a really powerful piece of the government's fiscal engine. And it would be a good idea to probably bring it back up to the level it was at. I mean, the provinces mostly stepped in and took that space, or at least some of the provinces did. So it's not like it actually went away in terms of the tax burden. So we have to be conscious of that. If the feds now go back in and restore 2 points on top of the 2 points that, Quebec and Ontario and so on, BC moved in and took, you're going to start to get the VAT, the GST kind of tax a little bit maybe too high in terms of economic growth. So you have to balance those things off.
Last question.
Fiscal policy, very complicated. That's worth a 3-hour seminar all by itself.
No
you
question.
Should get Frances Donald on the show sometime if you haven't, Brian. She's really fantastic on this stuff.
Last question, if I could. You said the first election you were on was 1974, where Trudeau went from a minority to a majority. Is history going to repeat itself?
So you're looking for a yes or no answer, right?
Yep.
Yes, I think it will.
Rick Anderson, fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for joining us. I look forward to hopefully inviting you back on my show. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Brian. Great talking to you.
That's Rick Anderson, principal of Earnscliffe Strategy Group, and a really nice guy. Thanks, Rick. Good night, everybody. I'm on Saga 960 AM, or you can stream me online at www.saga960am.ca every night at 7 p.m. Thanks for joining us. Good night.